All right, so I think we are live. So, Shannon, thank you so much for joining us today. Could you start just by giving us an introduction of who you are, what you do, and why you're here with us?
Okay. Yeah, my name is Shannon Clairmont. I work for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes here in Montana. I am the supervisory biologist here at the Bison Range. I supervise the biology department here on site at the range. So I've got two guys that work under me or work with me in the fields. One's a restoration ecologist, and the other is a field biologist. And so as of now, as of taking that title, I moved away from a lot of my field work, and I forward I take all the brunt of the meetings and a lot of paperwork off of their end. So, but they're the ones out there in the field doing the hands-on work and making this place shine.
Awesome. So how did you get involved in this? What was your pathway to where you are now?
When I first started out of high school, I was one of those guys that would have said I was never going to go back to school. I hated school. And so when I got out of high school, I worked various jobs. I did concrete work. I did painting houses. I did, all those manual labor jobs. And then I ended up doing some logging for a number of years. And during that stint of my career, I ended up getting sick with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So moving into that part of my life, I was doing chemotherapy, several times a week, and always down in a doctor's appointments. And so I couldn't work. I was disabled by the doctor. And so doing the treatments, I had a lot of spare time on my hands, and my wife was going to school at the time, and she suggested that maybe I should do something with my extra time and go back to school. Kind of pondered it for a while and decided, yeah, it's probably a good use of my time. Good time to do it, since the college that I was going to was just like two miles from my house, so it was an easy commute. Ended up there going in just the basics schooling, and was kind of tested by one of the professors there to go into environmental science. The college that I went to at Salish Kootenai College didn't offer a 4-year in wildlife, but they did offer, at that time it was only a 2-year college, a 2-year for a bachelor's in environmental science with a wildlife emphasis. So I started in on that program, and by the time I was about ready to finish the 2-year, they went to a 4-year on that program, and I went another year and was finishing the 3rd year up, and saw an ad in our local tribal paper for a biology trainee position with our tribe. I myself and 2 others were picked for that program, and we worked on an educational contract. So in the meantime, when I was going to college, I didn't have to work, but on my off times, I could go back to work and make money in between. And, there was no set time limit for when I needed to be at work and when I didn't. If I wanted to take some time off, I could do that. And so it was a nice fit for me at that time, because I was pretty busy still doing doctor's appointments and all of that. So to make a long story short, I was about ready to graduate from that college, and my boss at the time, after they had hired me, said that I had to go to a 4-year college to finish my degree out. So I transferred to U of M, and I did about a year and a half there to finish out my program, and then came to work for the tribe full time. At that time, we were just finishing up some mitigation that was done on behalf of the tribe for erosion of the lower river corridor from the hydroelectric dam, and the ramping up in the wintertime. And so what they were doing is a lot of baseline data collection at the time. And so that was the beginning of my career in biology, was doing baseline data on lands they were acquiring as wetland replacements for the highway. Um, from there, we just kind of spread out. We did a lot of small mammal trapping and doing trends of rodents and small mammals on the reservation, trying to get a sense of what the ecosystem health was and what our cycles of the rodents and the birds and the abundance of all them species also. And so we kind of branched out. All three of us went into our kind of our own little niches for biology. And at that point, there was a cousin of mine was working in carnivore management, and I was really kind of taken by that, very interested in it. And so I started pesting him to take me out with him. And he's like, well, you got to know your this, you got to know that. And I'm pretty sure I can handle that. And so he kind of started taking me out every now and then, and when they could, and then in the meantime, the other two biologist trainees that were working side by side with me were training in some of the aerial telemetry and big game counts. And at that time in their lives, they were both just getting married and starting their own families. And they ended up being pregnant, and the nausea of the aircrafts, they couldn't handle it. And so that was also pushed on me. And I ended up being the one that was doing all the flights for the tribe for about 20 years. I was doing big game flights. I was doing waterfowl, winter flights, bald eagle nest surveys, telemetry on wolves, and telemetry on grizzly bears. So any flight that would come up, I was usually part of that. Better part of 20 years on that. And then I was also working my way into grizzly bear management with my cousin. And we worked that together for about 17 years until his passing. And then at that time, let me step back a little bit here. In the beginning of my bison range career, the tribe had been asking the Fish and Wildlife Service for some sort of co-management of the bison range since the 1980s. And this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. The Fish and Wildlife finally agreed to a co-management proposal, and we interviewed for those positions, and I was the one chosen from the tribe to take that position as the biologist on the ground here. That didn't last out but about 2 seasons, and it didn't end real well. A lot of bickering between the tribes and Fish and Wildlife Service. So I kind of stepped back from that because that was just kind of a bad taste in my mouth for probably a good 10 years. The way we were treated and the way specifically that myself got from that, it just soured me pretty much. And so I didn't want anything to do with it. And they kept pestering me to come back for the other co-management deals they had, and I told them no on each one. And then Fish and Wildlife Service came up with a proposal to give it all back in 2020, and it was signed into law in 2020 by Donald Trump in his last year of that presidency. And it was wrote in as part of our water compact deal for the Flathead Reservation. So at that time, I was approached by the division manager again to come back out and work here. And through a lot of soul searching, I decided I could possibly do that. So I stepped back into the role. Since I was the only one from the tribe that actually worked here on the grounds with the buffalo, other than the maintenance workers, but none of them were coming back for this round. So they wanted a little familiarity here from how the Fish and Wildlife Service ran it to when we would step into that. So, And that's kind of how I began working here. Um, you know, the initial draw, the bison range, I think is the initial draw for everybody that comes here to visit. It's a small little postage stamp in the middle of a reservation, but it shows you the representation of all the wealth of wildlife that we have here. And it's all within 20,000 acres and viewable from your car. It's kind of like a little oasis in the middle of a desert, you know. It's kind of neat because you can come in here certain times of the year, like August, late August or so, you see the bison rut, and then October and September roll around, you got the elk rut, and after that, November, you got the deer rut, and then when winter comes around, it's pretty dead. The bison move around still, but there's not much that happens out here. But then when spring rolls around, you start to see all that movement again, and it's pretty neat to watch. Very interesting from a biological standpoint. And you get to watch animals in their own natural state where they're used to people, so they're not afraid to do things that they'd normally do out in the wild when we're not around. And so it gives you a whole different perspective on the life of an animal. And it's, you know, it's very interesting to me. And that's one of the reasons I really enjoy working here. Other than, you know, being with the animals themselves, it's just something that's always drawn me in from a kid on up to adulthood.
So I'll pause you there for a second, and I'll say, first of all, thank you for sharing your background. It was super interesting, and I think it represents probably how a lot of us are in our current roles, where we took a very circuitous route to get there and didn't have, you know, this very clear goal of, I want to do this, and this is where I want to be in 30 years. But I think your wealth of knowledge and your background have really added to your insights in the role that you're in now. So that was really interesting. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit more, if we could, about the bison range, and you've kind of highlighted this a little bit already, but just get into a little bit more, you know, why it's such an important place, and what do you hope when a visitor comes to the bison range, what do you hope that they walk away understanding, either about bison or about how bison are managed?
Yeah, the bison range itself, it's kind of a unique situation. Back when in the late 1870s, 1890s, our tribes were nomadic. They used to follow food sources throughout the year. And bison was one of those food sources that they'd hit several times a year, depending on their food rations and how well they preserved their food throughout the year. So in the late 1890s or so, that the tribe went over in a group, as they always did for a hunting group, and some of the chiefs went, and some of the tribal member families. One of the tribal members that was actually on one of those last few remaining bison hunts was a local family from here, and his name was Atatsi. And he noticed over the years that the bison were getting harder and harder to find. And of course, that was at the time of extermination of the bison by the federal government. So every time they go over, they were having a harder time finding these animals. And he suggested to his chiefs that they bring back some of the orphaned calves from the hunted adults. And his chiefs pondered it over for several days, and they decided against it at that time, because they didn't want to rock the boat with other tribes, start wars with tribes that were also over their liking. And so they denied him at that time. And years down the road, his son, Flatatsi, which is just a little bit different naming, but took up that plight of his father. And he again asked the chiefs if they could do that. And this time they agreed to it. And so he rounded up about half a dozen bison calves and took them from the eastern Montana over the Continental Divide and back to our reservation here. He free roamed them animals here next to the Flathead River, very close to where the bison range is today. And in fact, it was probably part of the bison range at that time. And he cultivated that herd up to about 100 and some animals within a few years. And at that time, anything that you didn't grow or make yourself, you had to travel a long ways to get to a store or to get your mail. And he was gone for several weeks. Flatatsi had to take off, and he was gone for several weeks. And while he was gone, his father-in-law was approached by the Allard and McDonald Allard family and was asked if they'd sell his herd of bison. Samuel Walking Coyote agreed to this and sold the herd out from under Flatatsi. And when he returned, he came back to find his bison were gone. And the Allards and Pablos had rounded them up and moved them a little bit further up the river corridor. And so, he was never given the credit for saving the bison as he did for our tribe and partially for the nation, actually, because it wasn't until 1908 when the federal government stepped in and wanted to sequestered this land here on the reservation for a bison range, is what they called it. Teddy Roosevelt specifically wanted this for bison and for an area for bison to reproduce and be sent out to other areas as a savior of the species. So, you go a little bit further down the line after this was acquired and the bison, they were looking for bison to stock it. The herd that the Allards had bought, when the federal government moved in, they were starting to allot the land, what they call excess land on our reservation to non-tribal members. The Pablo Allards herd had to be moved because it was a free-ranging herd. And so they had to either get rid of them or bring them into pens. So they decided to sell them out. A lot of them went to Elk Island in Canada, and a bunch went to the Conrad herd in Kalispell. And so the federal government wouldn't buy them from the Pablo Allard families. And it was just a couple of years later, they turned around and were looking for bison. And where did they find them? They found them at Elk Island and the Conrad herd. So the original descendants of the original bison that came back are what we have here. So it brings back full circle to our tribe and the commitment of Flatatsi to save the bison. So the bison weren't only saved by a tribal member, but the bison were also everything to the tribes. They're a one-stop shopping area. They provided food, they provided clothing, they provided tools, they provided strings for their bows, and anything they needed they could probably make out of bison or bison byproducts. So they were looked upon them as brothers of the Indian people. And when they went to harvest them, they said that if they offer themselves to you, that's an offering from the bison to you to keep you alive. And so they were highly cultural and highly thankful for the bounty they did give. And so they were considered parts of the family, members of the tribe, basically. So, you still see that, you don't see the deep connection like you used to for everything we need now, but you still do see the cultural relevance of it and the thankfulness when the tribes do get bison. It's one of those foods. I grew up on the reservation. We ate a lot of game meat, a lot of deer, a lot of elk. And when bison rolled around from Yellowstone Park as a part of their culling program, I can remember standing in lines just for a roast of bison. It was just that well received and wanted. And so to have our own herd here, even though this is a conservation herd, and I don't allow for these animals to be sent to slaughter for strictly food. They're meant to procreate and start other herds because the genetic makeup of these bison is fairly pure, and so we use the gene pool to perpetuate other herds in other areas. The bison from the bison range can be found all over the United States and Hawaii, and also in Alaska. They've been shipped everywhere, and they've started a lot of herds. So, including Yellowstone, they were supplemented the Yellowstone herd early on. So, this herd is immensely important, not only to our tribe but to the bison as a species. So, and it's pretty neat being a part of that, and just looking back at the history of that, even though it's, I'm just a little glimpse on the timeline there. And I may not make any huge achievements there, but at least I know I was part of it, and proud to do that.
Could you talk a little bit more, because I'm sure people will have questions, just about the day-to-day, what does your day-to-day bison management look like at the bison range?
It depends on the time of the year. Right now we're in full gear of noxious weeds eradication or management. You can imagine all the tourists that we get here. I think we sold 20-some thousand passes last year. And that's just cars. That doesn't count the people. That's how many cars we had go through the tour road. And so they're coming from all over the United States. But the problem with that is when they come from all over the United States, they also bring their problems with them, and they get deposited on the roads here and they spread. So almost in it, the exotic weed problem here on the range is just immense. Even though it's just a little postage stamp piece of ground here, we spend thousands upon thousands of dollars on weed management every year, and a lot of man hours. It's not only the three biological people that work here, but we include our maintenance workers in that maintenance, and also a lot of times aerial combating of it too. So it's quite expensive, and that takes up a lot of our time from spring into summer. Springtime, we're always waiting for April to roll around. That's when our calving season starts. This year, as of last week, I think we had 80 calves, which is a pretty good sized number. On average, would probably be around 60. This year, we've actually seen sets of twins. So the bison are doing really well health-wise. A lot of times you won't see a lot of set of twins, but we've seen several this year. And the bison are just looking dramatically healthy. So the last couple of years has been really good on them. And that might be due to more moisture in the ground, but we've been doing a lot of restoration projects here too. We're getting rid of annual grasses like cheatgrass and Ventonata dubii, desert wiregrass that has come in the last probably 15 years and just kind of devastated the rangeland here. Thousands upon thousands of acres been sprayed of that, and that's a 2-year restoration process in itself. Once we spray it, we can't plant anything for 2 years, and then the 3rd year we'll have to come back and try and rehab it and get rid of all the other exotic weeds that have grown in the place of the grass. So it's always a balancing act. We've got approximately 350 head of bison here, plus our calf crop now. And then we also have the large animals like elk, 2 species of deer, bighorn sheep, and pronghorn that also eat on the grass too. So it's kind of a balancing act, because we don't supplemental feed these animals at any time of year unless we're handling them. and we have them in a corral situation. So we try to keep it as wild as possible, so they eat what they have on the ground. They range on their own. People think that we put them in certain paddocks, certain parts of the year, and we just say it's the luck of the draw that if you see them, you're lucky. You know, 350 head of animal, a lot of animals, but I tell you what, these big bison can disappear in a matter of seconds in the open prairie grass, and you wonder where they go, but they're just constantly on the move, and it's really neat to watch.
So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. You got a question? I can finish that later.
Well, it's a bit tangential, so I don't want to go too off track, because I do want to keep this, about bison. But
yeah,
and I think it's important to recognize all of the work that the range is doing for bison specifically. But you touched on this briefly, and I wanted to ask before it slipped out of my brain: how does the presence of bison and bison grazing support all of those other species? So birds, insects, other wildlife, the grasslands themselves. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah. You hear it from everybody around that have worked with bison or bison ecologies. The bison are a keystone species, which means they're the beginning of a lot of other things happening after them. So bison, they're such big animals, and they run in herds, so you never see them alone hardly. And so when they move across the landscape, they're constantly knocking divots in the grass, knocking holes in the dirt, making wallows, and they're grazing the whole time they go along and do this. When bison come along, they're kind of like a cow on steroids. They go along and they take this roughage, and it's usually the roughest and biggest grasses out there, and they consume that. Well, while they're doing that, they're knocking down the upper levels of the higher, bigger grasses that are undigestible for other animals, and knocking it down to where they can see their food sources. So they're at the top of the chain, where it knocks the forage down to a manageable area to where others can come in and take advantage of that. And it just kind of goes down the line from there. So they'll do that. Elk will come in, deer will come in, and then the antelope will come in, and it has constant management for birds. It enhances their forage because it keeps the ecosystem healthy. The grasses are there to help cover them for their nesting. And also when they're rolling around and doing their wallows, they're opening up dirt areas for new seed to start. And those wallows can also turn into a temporary wetland. So you can see like toads or salamanders hatch out of there, or it's a watering hole for birds, or it's just kind of an all-around type of animal, and it just kind of prepares the land for other animals to come along and take advantage also. And it's kind of neat to watch the hierarchy of nature work its wonders, because you try to put something together like that on your own, you'd never be able to make it work as smooth.
Yeah, they've got it figured out for sure.
They do, yeah.
How do you balance, some of those broader conservation goals for bison with things like, managing herd health and population management? How do you make all those pieces work together?
Well, since we're kind of a closed herd, we do handle our animals. We try not to treat them as livestock as much as possible. We try to only handle them. I was on a 2-year schedule, but that's kind of going by the wayside. So I think we'll probably end up going back to the yearly cycle. Our animal numbers right now, like I said, we're sitting at about 350 adults. And that's probably our max for right now, with the available forage that we have and rangeland that we have that's not being inundated by weeds. So when you're looking at bison numbers, you got to think about what you have for AUMs, if you're talking ranching, animal unit months, what do we have for forage that is actually optimal for them? What are they eating? What are they leaving behind? So you're kind of looking at the range as a grocery store. So do they have enough in store for the year? And if we want any higher than, I would say probably 400 or so, it would really be taxing things on a hard year. And we might have to cross a line to where we would have to feed them. And that's just something that you really don't want to do. At least we don't. We're looking to keep them wild as possible. We try not to vaccinate unless we have to. We try not to intervene unless we have to. So, we see a lot of gore wounds come in when we handle in the fall. And that's just part of nature. That's part of the rut. These big bulls come in with gash wounds from them poking holes in each other with their horns. If we see it's a hard burden on that animal, we can take some initiative and wash it out, spray it with some antibiotic spray, and then give them a long-term antibiotic. And that's about as much as we'll do. If it's to the point to where their quality of life is not, up to a certain standard, like with broken bones, that's just not fair to leave an animal slowly die like that. So we will euthanize something like that if it's become a burden on them. But otherwise, culling the herd is done annually, and we do it through an auction. And so anybody is welcome to join in on that auction. It's a closed bid auction. The animals are sold as live animals. They have to leave alive. And so when they buy these animals, they know they're live, and they have to schedule with us to come in and pick them up. And we help them load them and get them on their trailers and on their way. So every year we try to keep our herd normal as possible. So when you're looking at age of a herd, you're looking at about a third of our animals are going to be older, a third are going to be middle-aged, and a third are going to be young. And then also you look at the hierarchies of that, and the matriarchs, and the types of and sexes of animals that we keep. So we try to keep that about 50-50 as it would be in nature. So we're about 50% cows and 50% bulls. It might go a little higher on one end for a couple of years, but it'll usually average back out in the long run. We try not to pull them family groups apart too often, especially the older animals. Our sale animals are usually targeted towards the younger age classes, up to about 3 years old. After that, I think they have a little bit harder time going into new herds. They're still accepted up to about that age, but I think it's a little tougher on the animal itself. So we've been really trying to work our way back to yearlings and 2-year-olds for removal of any sort.
So listening to that, and then kind of going back to earlier when you were talking about how these bison have essentially been, you've sensed Yellowstone and all over the place. So how are you, or do you, I should say, how are you monitoring herd genetics and tracking, that lineage as it comes back to you?
Fish and Wildlife Service had a really good process where when they called through what they called familiar lines. When they looked at their genetic bases, they'd pull anything that was highly related to the herd itself. That was their call animal. So they were trying to avoid genetic bottlenecks like that. When we took over, we kind of, for the first couple of years, getting our feet underneath us, we did a random draw. And then we were approached by Fish and Wildlife Service and several other government entities asking us if we would be part of what they call the meta population. And it's a network of bison herds throughout the United States that are monitored through one general database. and they're genetically followed that way. So the managers of the database are looking at all these different herds on different refuges, and they're monitoring the genetics of that. And if they start to see genetics go down in one area on one refuge, we can pull from another refuge and bring genetics in. We can pull multiples, we can pull singles, depending on the herd size that they're going to, and vice versa. So it's a way to keep your gene pool fresh and keep a pretty healthy system going, and also avoid the bottlenecks of inbreeding and the pitfalls of that.
Awesome, thank you. So kind of shifting gears just a little bit, how, if it does, maybe it doesn't, but how does tribal stewardship differ, or how is it similar to traditional, federal wildlife management approaches and decisions?
Yeah, we're fairly similar on a lot of the way we manage things here. The tribe has a little more leeway, I think, in some of the things they do. The tribe is not funded by the United States public, so anything that Fish and Wildlife Service was under scrutiny by public comment and our public lawsuit. The tribe has a little more leeway in that, since it's a private herd now, and it's no longer publicly funded. So we generate the funds that go into this place. And when we do have questions about something that might not look right, I mean, we do still follow NEPA process for all our tribal stuff. So, there's some regulations in there that, it's very similar to what the Fish and Wildlife Service would do. But I say we've got a little more leeway in what we can do without having to go higher into the red tape of things to do it. For instance, I know the Fish and Wildlife Service was looking at thinning some of the Douglas fir up here for years. And they were looking for a forester to come in and help them. And I think they finally got an evaluation from a forestry team. And I think they still would have been a good 10 years out before they got a project on the ground by the time they got all the approvals. I looked at the report that these guys did and went to their presentation, and they were looking at logging. I'd rather not log this area and bring in more weeds. And they were wanting to obliterate some of the roads and rebuild roads. And I'm like, that's not at the heart of what we want to see there. We'd like to kind of go back to what it would be turn of the century, or the late 1800s, early 1800s, where it's still a grassland community with what you'd call a savanna, a pine savanna. So we're slowly working our way back to that. We're getting more fire on the ground yearly. We're doing some cutting on the Douglas fir up there, and we're going to try and get some underburns in this year. We were meant to burn it a year and a half ago, right when the government shut down. So it shut down our burn program, because our burn program is BIA. And so our hands were tied. We had a bunch of fuel on the ground, but no way to burn it. So we've had to let that sit for a year and a half now. And we're hopefully going to be able to burn that this coming month.
Could you talk about that a little bit more? I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm assuming that, a lot of people listening to this will understand, the role that fire plays there. But could you talk a little bit more about why you're doing that and why that's important?
Yeah. When the reservation was formed in the late 1800s, the tribes, like I said, were nomadic. They followed food sources around year to year. Once they stayed in the spot and they saw it degrade to a certain point where it wasn't producing what it used to, what they would do is set it ablaze before they left, and then just walk away and let the fire take care of that. When they did that, it kept grasslands. It kept encroachment out. We didn't have problems with Douglas fir encroachment like we do now, or juniper encroachment that we've got on the river corridor. All those seedlings probably would have been burnt out by them fires. When Fish and Wildlife Service took over, it was about that time in history when they were shutting down all open burning like that by tribes because they thought that was inherently bad. And what they didn't realize is they were shutting down a healthy ecosystem and letting it become decadent and build fuels and become a more devastating fire when it did burn. So right now we're sitting on the Bison Range and they haven't had a natural fire here that was actually allowed to burn since the 1950s. So we're sitting on about 100 years of buildup of fuels. And a lot of that is Douglas fir. It's come in heavy and it's monocultured a lot of our hillsides. There's some remnant pine still in there, but not as much as it should be. So our field program through our fire program in Ronan, I got together with them, and as part of their fuels reduction on the reservation, they took me on as part of their project, and we've worked out a calendar set up to where they're going to be in here for the next 10 years, knocking down Douglas fir that are up to about 8 inches around, spacing out the Douglas fir, the bigger ones that are up there, opening up more ground, and then just letting that wood cure out for about a month or two, and then they'll go through and underburn it. Once that starts to happen, we'll see more burning happen in some of the live trees. And so you'll start to see these natural mosaics come back that fire would have put in the ground on its own. And once the mosaics start, the grass remnants are still there. Once you go through and burn it a couple times, it really pops some native grasses back out. And they really come out strong and healthy again. And it gives them enough sunlight to where they can grow, and it makes for a healthier ecosystem again. Like I said, this should be a pine savanna, not a Douglas fir patch. And we're pushing a lot of Douglas fir in areas up here that should be pine. So in order to get rid of a lot of that, I think I just use fires to do it. It's more of a natural way to do it, and I don't have to bring logging trucks in to do it or heavy machinery to tear up the ground.
No, that's great. Thank you for that explanation, because I think a lot of people will find that really helpful context to have. Are there any other, of these more traditional stewardship practices that you think need to be or should be adopted, in bison management, or maybe that are starting to be, and you're glad that they're back?
Yeah, the burning itself, I think a lot of tribes are taking that into hand, and you're seeing a lot more tribes that never used to do it or hadn't done it in probably 100 some years, take back that option and use it. It's a good way to clean things up, get rid of decadence, restart areas, the vegetation that had just been slowly dying off or overcrowding themselves. Willows and grasses and all in sedges, they thrive on that, and it doesn't have to happen every year. It's just something that should happen. Like I'd say our normal timeline would be 5 to 10 years. There should be a good sized fire that runs through here, in this lowland, and open things back up. Even though we won't be up to that par for years and years, but over the next 10 years, I hope to at least burn every part of this range at least once. And that's something you're starting to see a resurgence of. I think you're starting to see a lot of tribes go back and restore a lot of areas that have been damaged through progress, bringing back a little bit more of their cultural plants, You know, plant communities are pretty important to the people. You don't ever think about it, but everything springs from them. So go figure that they should be an important part of what you think about when you're looking at the land. But yeah, you know, every tribe is a little bit different than one another, so they've all got their cultural practices that are different from us. And you know, I would just say try to integrate them into your programs. They worked for millennia, and they will still work again.
Well, and I think it's really important to think about how the past influences what we're doing now, and then also how it impacts the future. And we're coming up on our hour, so I don't want to take too much more of your time, but you gave me a really great segue to the last question I have for you. And obviously, I'm going to ask it now so you have time to answer and then also add, because I know I've cut you off about a million times. So I want to make sure you have time to finish any other thoughts you had. But my last question for you was, so you talked about the past, talked about the present. What does the future of the Bison Range look like for the next 10, 20, 100 years?
You know, I'm hoping that we continue to proliferate, you know, and it was signed into public law when it was given back that it was supposed to remain open to the public and for the bison. And I don't think that's going to change in any time. You know, I would just like, you know, people to come in and learn about the past and learn about the importance of these animals. You'd be surprised on the amount of people that come through here, and they're just amazed at the size of them. Or, you know, you wouldn't think they're that big, but they're the size of pickup trucks, for God's sakes. And you know, it's really neat to learn about things like that. You think back about, you know, ages back when the Indian people used to be able to take them without using horses, and you know, that's a resilience that we'll never know. It's just, you know, learning about your past, and that's one thing that the Bison Range has brought back was our own past in our own words. The federal government, when they tried to tell our past, they told parts of different tribes and parts of tribal stories that weren't ours, and used different languages than ours. And we tried to get them to change it, and they just wouldn't change it. So when we got it back, we changed it to our language, to our storyline, to our place names. You know, we're taking, I wouldn't say taking it back as their own, but we're trying to put that history context into it, so people can learn. You know, it wasn't always the way it is now. There were a lot of different things that happened here on the reservation that even I don't know about. You know, and it's kind of sad because, you know, you don't learn if you don't know your history.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Shannon. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about today?
No, I think that's pretty good. Good segue, I think.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, hopefully got what you wanted out of it, and I answered your questions, hopefully.
Of course.